Hello, welcome back. Next up on the data science and analytics track here at PyCon Australia 2021 is coming from London, Eyal Kazin, who's an ex-cosmologist turned data scientist with over 10 years experience in machine learning, statistical inference, and data insights visualizations. Eyal's claim to fame is having lived in 4 different continents within the span of a decade, including 3 tennis Grand Slam cities, like New York, where he obtained his PhD in astrophysics, Melbourne, where he did a postdoc stint at Swinburne, and London, where he now resides. Eyal's topic today is one that has a direct relationship to real life. How do we optimize for multiple objectives, especially when they are in conflict? For example, how can one best overcome the classic trade-off between quality and cost? In his talk, Eyal will introduce us to multi-objective optimization using Pareto Fronts for the data-driven decision makers in the audience, which I honestly hope is all of you. We'll hear about the advantages and shortcomings of the technique and be able to assess applicability for our own projects. Welcome back to Melbourne. Eyal, everybody, Eyal Kazin and Improved Decision Making with Pareto Fronts.
Hi, good morning. Hi, good morning. I just want to mention that there is a technical difficulty and I cannot hear anything. So Javier, if you have anything to say, please put it in the chat at the moment and we'll just have to communicate that way. I hope that's fine. So I'll just give you 1 second to give me that feedback. Otherwise, I'll just start. Okay, you hear me. That's great. Okay, great. So hi, everyone. Hello from London. My name is Eyal. I'm a senior data scientist at Babylon, and I'm very happy to be here at in this conference to talk about optimizing with Pareto Fronts. And any other things, Javier, I should be mentioning before, or should I just start? Okay, all right, great. So I'll start. We're now living in an era of data-driven decision-making, and there's always an interesting challenge that arises is how do we make decisions when dealing with multiple parameters? Normally, these are not, there are trade-off decisions to be made, making this a very challenging procedure. What sort of trade-offs do I mean? Well, you can always think about the classical trade-off, for example, between price and quality that we experience not only in our work lives, but also in our everyday lives. Sometimes the relationship between quality and price is not that clear. And so we have to make a trade-off decision. And this also manifests in just about any industry that you can think of. You could probably imagine in your own industry, different considerations that you have to make. For example, you can imagine in the case of home food delivery services. On the one hand, they want to optimize the experience for people ordering food at home, but also they have to optimize for the kitchens as well as the delivery personnel. You cannot focus on one and neglect the others. I got exposed to this in the field of drug discovery. I worked in a biotech lab with protein engineers, and what I learned there is that in order for a protein to be considered a viable drug for our health, it has to pass rigorously many tests. Here I'm just listing a few characterizations that a protein has to abide by, and it takes only one for a drug to fail the test. And before the days of COVID, these sort of processes would take up to a decade, and these are very expensive, like millions and billions of dollars. So if something like toxicity doesn't pass, you want to learn about this as soon as possible. And hence the need to optimize for multiple parameters simultaneously. Normally, when people think about optimizing for 2 or more parameters or objectives, what they do is not multiple objectives. They combine them together into this heuristic, which actually in the literature is called single objective optimization. And so one thing you'll take away from this talk is the limitations of this common practice and how this is resolved by a technique called Pareto Fronts, and why they yield better solutions. And then I'll talk about applicability. And for those who are interested, I'll provide you free online material where you can gain hands-on experience to really master this topic. This is for you if you use data to make decisions and you're interested in improving your optimization skills. There's no real maths background needed, and Python knowledge can be fairly basic. So just about a bit about myself. Thank you for the introduction, Javier. I currently work as a data scientist in health tech. As Javier said, I spent the end of my extensive academic career in Swinburne University in Melbourne, Australia. So very glad to be here in a conference in Australia. And most relevant for this talk is 2 years that I spent in LabGenius, a biotech company in which I learned the trade of multi-objective optimization in the context of drug discovery. So I'll show like a use case from there. This is the agenda that I prepared for today, in which we already covered the motivation. Next, we'll talk about the basics of the concept of Pareto Fronts. Why are they useful? Then I'll give real-world example with an emphasis on applicability. How can you, is this relevant for the projects you're working on? And this last part, if there isn't time, you'll have online material in which you'll be able to use something called genetic algorithms for those who are interested in applying in practice. So with that, I can start with the talk. Optimization means different things to people. So for practitioners, I like this, this definition by Professor Deb as a procedure of comparing feasible solutions until really there's no more that can be found, either practically or just in terms of resources. You know, a topic is interesting if the creator of the illustrations of XKCD actually has a cartoon about it. So I like this one over here, which is useful to understand the concepts of multi-objective optimization. So imagine that you're, so what you see here is the creator Randall just subjectively distributed his how tasty he finds fruit. And so let's just imagine you're an office mate of his and you want to treat him with the most tasty fruit according to him. So of course you're going to hand him a peach. But let's say he also, he's leaving the office and you want to provide him with the most easiest fruit to eat on the go. So then you'll give him seedless grapes. But then the question arises, and this I actually want you to answer in the chat, is which is the optimal fruit if you want to optimize both for taste and easy? So just take a few seconds to think about it and just pop in the chat, which one fruit do you think would be optimal? Which one should you give to it here, both for ease and taste? I'm not seeing anybody write in the chat yet. So I'll give you a few more seconds. I was told actually that it might be a delay in some countries. So remember, you want to optimize for easy and tasty. Okay. Chris, you say bananas. I'm not sure about that. I see one for peaches. Okay. So while you're thinking about it, I'll just give you the answer. Actually, it was a trick question. There's no one fruit that's optimal, but rather we have to consider a set of optimal solutions called an optimal front or Pareto front. And the purpose of this talk is to have you understand why these are all considered equally optimal and how we can make use of this when we're doing multi-objective optimization. So what does optimizing look like? So imagine that you have a parameter space in which we have two objectives. Very creatively, I call them here objective 1 and objective 2. And imagine that this is like, as an analogy, like a dark room. You know nothing about these objectives. This could be quality and price, or this could be characteristics of a protein, or this could be the user experience of in home delivery service, the experience of the people who ordered food or people who are creating the food in the kitchen. So any two parameters that you can imagine, you don't know what to expect. So what does optimization look like? So normally what's common practice, what I refer to as single objective optimization is what a lot of analysts do. They just do some sort of multiplication, for example. And so what they're doing, they're tunneling, let's say with a flashlight, they're just going through this tunnel of space, just optimizing for this one direction, right? And then they'll conclude that this solution is the most optimal. And so, of course, there's different algorithms. You can add, you can take the mean, and let's say you want to, that's when you're maximizing both. But you can imagine maximizing one, minimizing the other, then you can take the difference or divide, okay? when I was working in the biology lab, I learned that actually some processes is what's I call linear one ID optimization, in which they choose one objective, they maximize that one direction, and then they turn around for the second one. And then in this case, like they say, oh, this is optimal. But that was a subjective choice. Why did they take objective one? They could have just as easily take objective two, go maximize in one direction, and then maximize the other direction and say, well, this is optimal, right? 3 different methods, 3 different choices. And so imagine, again, this is us using a flashlight in a dark room. What do you really want to do? Well, you want to turn on the light in the room and absorb the full solution space. So here I'm highlighting these 3 solutions that we chose as optimal in this highly curated distribution. But if we had the lights turned on, then we're most likely, subjectively just looking at it and say, well, this one is more likely to be more optimal than the rest of them. That was very subjective, but there's a whole lot of others which we can, with some mathematical rigor, we can say, well, all of these are considered equally optimal. They're called Pareto Front solutions. And you can see of the 3 ones that are in red, this one is not in this optimal set. Why is that? Well, that's the purpose of the next few slides that we'll get to. But before that, we have to talk about subjectivity. I mentioned the word subjectivity a few times, and why is that important? Well, I like to think of this quote by Molière, which says that, in other words, it says that if you truly believe that you understand something without exploring it, then you're just fooling yourself. So that's my takeaway from this statement. And what does that have to do with what we're talking about? Is the fact that in any analysis, as objective as we want to be, we're going to make a subjective decision at some stage. The question is, when are we going to make this? So when I talk about single objective optimization, then normally we're creating an ad hoc heuristic, we're creating a heuristic before we're actually doing the search. The purpose of this talk is to convey that with the Pareto Front method, you actually want to hold on to that decision, not make it, be open for anything that comes, and make that decision only after you start exploring the data. And that's what we'll see in the next few slides. So that's the importance of subjectivity. And when you think about it, what do I mean by analysts making subjective decisions in general? Well, anytime you have a distribution and you want to quote it by number, let's say you decide the mean, mode, or median. Well, if you have a perfectly symmetric bell curve shape, then it's all the same. It doesn't matter. But most real-life data is skewed, and so that's important. Maybe it's bimodal, right? So you have to learn the data and then make a subjective decision, and the good analyst makes sure that's a sound decision that can be justified. The same thing when you decide the bins of a histogram, the same things when you decide, should I present data in a linear scale or a log scale, right? So these are subjective decisions that we make, and it all depends on context. So same here, when you decide what's optimal, first look at your parameter space and then make that decision. So with that in mind, we're ready to define what a Pareto Front is. So beforehand, in order to define that, we have to, when we look at a scatter plot, we have to differentiate between 2 types of solutions. So these are two dimensions of objective space, and we have to define all solutions either as what we call dominated or non-dominated, where the non-dominated are what's called Pareto optimal. So what do we mean by that? So let's learn by example. For example, this solution K over here. So it's classified as dominated because there's at least one other solution that is better, that has better performance both in objective 1 and objective 2, assuming that we want to maximize both. In that case, for example, we have N and E. The reason N is also called dominated is because E dominates N both in objective 1 and objective 2. The reason that E is considered non-dominated is because there's nobody over here that dominates it both in objective 1 and objective 2. You can say, well, F dominates it in 1, right, in this direction, but it doesn't dominate it in objective 2, in the vertical direction. Same thing, but the opposite for D. D performs better in objective 2, but not in objective 1. So that's why E is considered non-dominated, and hence what we call Pareto optimal. And the same goes for all of these solutions A through H. So again, the definition of a Pareto front is a set of non-dominated solutions. And then you can ask the question, well, which is optimal. So that's where the subjectivity comes in. So we haven't made that subjective decision, and they're still considered equally optimal. And then once we have this look of the space, then you take it, then you or whoever the domain expert is, then you create a subjective ranking. You can either focus on these over here, or maybe you're more interested in the ones over here. It really depends on context, as we'll see. Another thing that's worth highlighting is a nice thing about this approach is we did not care about the units of scale, right? In this could be anywhere between, milligrams to kilograms. It doesn't matter, because you're going to get, mathematically, you're just going to get the same differentiation between dominated to non-dominated. So that's what Pareto's fronts are. So before we look at applicability, we'll talk about we'll just summarize. Okay, so a Pareto front is a set of trade-off non-dominated solutions, and they should be all considered equally optimal. Throughout this talk, I'll show you in two-dimensional space, but this is also relevant for any n-dimensional space. This extrapolates to many dimensions. And remember that the context of subjectivity, we don't make any prior constraints before looking at the distributions. If there are limitations, of course, you put them in, but otherwise, if there's no good reason to put constraints, you won't use them. And the reason that Pareto optimization, as you'll see, is better than the single objective optimization is because you're really getting a broad, like a bird's eye view of the solution space, as opposed to putting on horse blinders. Okay, so with that, in order to practice this concept, I created an app, and here's the link. So feel free to go into the link, and I'll just quickly, I'll demonstrate it. Cool. So I call it Pareto Whack because just like in Whack-A-Mole, the objective is to look at a distribution and try to guess which solutions are actually Pareto optimal. So Javier, I will ask for you in the chat to give me a number. So this will be a seed number of a distribution that I'm not aware of. I cannot see. 705. Okay, so I will put in 705. Thank you for that. Very thoughtful of you. Okay, so this is a new distribution I have not seen before. Okay, so, and I want to maximize, let me make sure I want to do max because that's easier to understand. You can do any combination, but we'll do max in this case. That's what I'm asked for. How many of the 50 solutions are Pareto optimal? So my understanding, and something you'll gain with time, that's the purpose of this sort of app, is to learn that 1, 2, 3. Hopefully I'm right. I don't always get it right, but I think that it's 3. So I answer it here. And in this case, I'm correct. Okay. Javier, give me another number quickly, if you have one. Just want to see if I can. 5. Okay, so that's a 5. Okay. 5. New distribution. Okay, that's a bit easy. This is 2, but yeah, but so I don't always get it right. That's the point I wanted to make. Cool. So feel free to play around with that app. You'll have the link again if you want to see it. Maybe I'll just put it in the chat as well. Okay. Cool. So yeah, so feel free to play around with that just to understand the topic. Okay, so we're nearly there. I'm nearly there in which I can talk about real world. So I'm going to share my screen like this. Okay, we're nearly ready to present it in the real world, but beforehand, I have to talk about 2 different spaces. So we talked about objective space, but now we're talking about something called decision space. And what does that mean? So far, we were focusing on Pareto fronts in the objective space. How do we optimize for it? But there is this other set of parameters, which is called a decision space. And what do I mean by that? The objective space is what we're interested in, right? That's the price versus quality. That's what we're interested at the end of the pipeline. But we don't have control over that. There are parameters. Think of those knobs. Those are the things that we turn around, and that's what we're actually interested in. We can make decisions on. Okay, so I'll give a few toy examples and a few real life examples. This is a classical toy example called the knapsack problem. And so the objective of the knapsack problem is you have a lot of boxes, and they all have value and they have weight. And your objective, you have 2 objectives. You want to create, you have to put them in a knapsack in which you want to maximize for, let's say you want to maximize for value of the packages, but you want to minimize for weights. Okay, my axes here aren't perfect, but just imagine that you make these combinations. That's your decision space, and then you have your objective space, in which, again, it's value versus weight, okay? And so what's also important to emphasize is you need a mapping between them. The mapping here is quite trivial, right? You just weigh the boxes, or you quantify the monetary, and that way, that's the mapping between decision space to objective space. So this is a very useful toy example, and later I'll show you how you can actually learn this more in detail. But I want to mention that I use this as a perfect analogy for my work in therapeutic discovery. And so what I mean by that is when I was working with protein engineers, they have full constraint over the DNA sequences. So those are things that they can easily order from a lab, and they actually construct it within their own settings. And so I was helping them decide what is the best DNA sequence to optimize for what we're interested in. We're interested in protein function. That might be how it binds to another protein, its potency, that means how effective it is, or rather something deleterious, like how toxic is it. So, and so this is what they decide, this is what we're interested in, but the real expense actually is in the mapping, because just having a sequence on your computer screen to actually measure this, well, you need a full-fledged laboratory. And so that's very expensive. And that's what LabGenius, the biotech company I work in, they actually have that. So they have the biological setting. And I was working in a machine learning group, and we were actually creating this, using machine learning, this mapping between sequence to protein function, so we can optimize for the drug discovery. We were working in the context of Crohn's disease. So here I'll just show you this a case study. It isn't the Crohn's disease case study. This is kind of like I'm actually using public data as opposed to their priority data, as opposed to the proprietary data. And so the data that I'm using is small proteins called antibodies, in which they're about 200 in length, but there are about 20 locations which were causing mutations. And so 20 to the power 20, that's a very large space. That's intractable. It's 10 to the 10 with 26 digits. 10 to the power 26. And so it's actually mostly what's called wild type. And that's what I manifest here in this frequency distribution. So here are the 20 locations. I just put them all side by side. And here you can see that 90% of the time, this first one is T, and 10% of the time, it's these other letters that you can't see because they're squashed. So that's what I mean by 90% wild type. And the goal was to discover the best candidate for binding and potency. And again, I mentioned that we use machine learning to create that mapping, that link between protein sequence to binding. So yeah, I don't expect you to fully understand the setup, and it's fine. But here I just want to show you a nice way that I visualized exploring the decision space. So what you're seeing here is not before I showed frequency, but here I'm showing the frequency change. So the way to read this is that here, for example, it's remember I mentioned T in the first position. Here it's actually rejecting it and preferring it, for example, T over that, as opposed to these locations here in which it actually likes the wild type. I don't remember what it is, but it actually likes the, it's probably Y. So it actually likes the wild type. And definitely here it likes the wild type. That's what you're seeing here, and this is the decision space. But remember I talked about objective space. This is what we're actually interested in, let's say binding and potency. And so I'll just rerun the video from the start here. And you can see the solution space started from over here. And here I'm like doing explore, exploit, like looking at the space. And the objective is to get over here. And I'm looking for solutions, meaning these sort of combinations, to get to this region over here. So this is one way. And the way I'm using it is, you see here this Pareto front. If you start to get the riff of how to identify Pareto fronts, here they're all marked with X. As I mentioned here. So this is the Pareto front of this distribution. So then you write fast, okay, so great. So you have this, you did many iterations. So how do you decide which proteins to suggest that they actually order and engineer for? Well, that's really subjective. That really depends on the domain. So the purpose is whatever decisions we made, we did it only after the search, remember, not before the search. So that's exactly what I'm talking about. In our case, the protein engineer told me, well, we're not interested in this region. This is too low. And this objective, these are too low. And this objective, well, definitely take these and then anything in this vicinity. And so what we ended up doing is testing over here, for example. And so this is one way to go about it. So again, the purpose of that slide is to emphasize the subjective. You have to make a subjective decision at some stage, but you want to hold that to the end. This is another case study. So if you're familiar with machine learning, then these parameters that are called hyperparameters. And so these are things that, again, that we can control for. So here, for example, there's this technique called decision trees, and it has one parameter called learning rate and the number of trees. That's what we control for, hence our decision space. But that's not what we're interested in. What we're interested in actually is precision, recall, accuracy, and other related metrics. And the mapping is a whole process of machine learning, of training, cross-validation, testing, etc., going between these parameters to what we're actually interested in. So this is common practice for machine learning practitioners. Most of them do single objective optimization, but I was happy to find this article online in which this team from SAS Institute, they actually use multiple objective optimization and Pareto Fronts in order to do hyperparameter tuning. So here I'm just highlighting, they have a whole lot of case studies. Here I'm just highlighting just one of them, a company called Donors Choose, in which they're helping this organization provide materials for teachers. The thing is that they get many proposals. Only about 20% of them are actually worth their while, and so they wanted a machine learning algorithm to tell them to maximize, to minimize misclassification and minimize simultaneously false positive rates. Yeah, so the details don't matter, but the fact that they had two objectives to minimize for, and that's what I'm showing over here. So here, so just using the vanilla parameters, without doing any test, they have, this misclassification about 15% and just about 3.5% false positive rate. And so they tried single objective optimization, minimize, a few metrics, and you can see it massively reduced misclassification, but actually it did worse in terms of false positive rate. And the importance of this, and so they said, then they did multi-objective optimization, and here you can see the distribution of all the solutions they looked at, and you can see highlighted here in green is the Pareto front. Well, now we're at this juncture. Well, we have all these solutions. How do we make a decision? Well, what they said, well, before making a decision, they noticed this odd bump over here. So what they said is they'll do a cutoff at misclassification, and they'll rerun their calculation. So here, just focusing on this box, they have this other nice visual, which they show, well, the green dots are the same as before. All these dots are the same, except for these triangles. In these triangles, what they did is what they called a constraint search. So even though they were open for all parameters before, now they're saying only accept solutions that have a misclassification less than 0.15, where this bump is. And so hence they got these triangles, and then they get, again, at this point, well, we have to decide one of these, and this is where subjectivity comes in. You just go, well, I think this one is the best. Let's go with that, okay? So that's the idea. And the end result is, compared to this initial data point, they show that in terms of false positive rate, to get to this point, they reduce about a relative 8%, and misclassification they improve by an absolute 5%. So if you're a machine learning practitioner, then it's extra resources to do these calculations, but you might get an edge by doing so. So another question for the audience. I talked about how to identify Pareto fronts. I challenged myself. I gave you an app. Let's see what you see over here. So let's say, what's the which fruit are Pareto optimal for the opposite for before? We want to be nasty colleagues, and we will want to provide them with the fruit that's most difficult and most untasty. So if people could just answer in the chat what they think it is before I give the answer. So I'll give you about 10 seconds. Which fruit are both difficult and untasty, according to Randall? 5 more seconds. All right, so these are the ones that I picked up. These are all considered Pareto optimal if we want to. Yes, I appreciate that the chat is a bit delayed, but okay, cool. So yeah, so if you got it, great. If not, then in any case, you have the app to play around with it. Is Pareto Fronts relevant for the projects that you're working on? That's what we're addressing over here. So you want to look into this technique if you're dealing with conflicting objectives. The next thing, my experience with my conversation with people, I realized that not everybody has full control over the decision space. So you want full control over that. And then when it comes to the objective space, you need an inexpensive mapping, because sometimes you can make the decisions, but in order to map that to the actual objective space, that might be very time consuming or might be very expensive. And so that's another consideration. There's also a further consideration is how big is your objective space or decision space. For example, when I talked about drug discovery, well, the DNA sequence space is astronomical, and hence what you need is a stochastic algorithm in order to navigate the space. And so one recommended technique is genetic algorithms, and that so with that actually is that last topic. But I think how much more time do we have for this talk? Okay, I was asked to wrap up, so that's fine. So okay. So don't worry about the rest of the material. You'll have all access to all the material online. So I actually, in the past conferences, I have a hands-on tutorial in which, if you're interested to go over this material again and have again hands-on experience with the knapsack problem with Jupyter notebooks. So you have all of that over here. I'll just very quickly show you what it looks like. I see already 14 of you are actually looking at it, so that's great. So just quickly to go through it. Okay, so what it is you have basically videos of me talking exactly about this topic, and you'll have Jupyter notebooks in which you can actually practice this, in which you learn about genetic algorithms and various techniques so you can use in your own projects. Okay, so sorry, I'm just going to share so I can see the okay, so just to, just to summarize, multi-objective optimization is useful when you have conflicting objectives, you have full control over your decision space, and you have an inexpensive mapping to the objective space. Yeah, if you have an intractable objective space, you might consider genetic algorithms. Again, you have all the material online. You have the tutorial. You can play the Pareto Whack game. If anybody's interested in more material online, I highly recommend anything by Zitzler. It's a great read. And there's also a Python prototyping module called Deep, which I highly recommend as well to do prototyping. I find it very useful. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Eyal. This has been great. And unfortunately, we don't have time for more questions, but I think, you know, all these follow-through materials and follow-on materials are gonna tide us. So thank you, Eyal, again. And next up on today's data science and analytics track at PyCon AU 2021 is a closing session with Lars Jenken, Systems of the World, Cataloging the World's Data for Great Good. Please stay on. He will be on in another 10 minutes at 4:45 Australian Eastern Time.